before I go and do it here.
Okay.
All right. Well, welcome officially again. This is our fourth class for Introduction to the Gospels. And I'll also be leading this class in a forum on Sunday mornings, probably for the season of Lent. So if you're able to come in person or you want to refresh, if you've missed anything, you can come and take part then too. But good to have you all here. I'm going to share my screen and get us going on the production here. So as the last few weeks, I just have started my screens with this, my presentations with this screen. This is the book that was written by a professor of mine back in seminary that was really pretty impactful in me and introducing me to these ideas. So that's why I'm sharing that. Okay. So last week, remember Mark?
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about Mark. We talked a lot about Mark. And this is one of the traditional images of Mark, which I had not looked up last week to remind myself why it is, but by now I have. So when the different evangelists or gospel writers are depicted in art or statuary from early days, often Mark's gospel is depicted as a lion with wings, or the author is depicted as a lion with wings. And I don't know that there's total uniformity about why that is, but one of the things I read said that it's because Mark's gospel begins with John the Baptist, who's kind of a fiery orator, and so is a lion. And they also these different images connect to some of the iconography or images that are found in the book of Revelation. Okay, let me add Carol here again. So Mark is a lion with wings. Don't know exactly why, but so what do you remember, if anything, that is different about or unique about Mark?
No birth stories.
No birth stories, right? That's a little different. Anything else come to mind? Hi, Carol.
Hi.
Glad you could join us.
I'm sorry I'm late. I needed to reboot my phone.
No worries.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. So
Thank
we're
you.
just remembering a little bit about what we talked about, what made Mark unique. Any other ideas about Mark?
Mm.
And immediately.
Immediately, yes. Do you remember how many times the word immediately appears? 42 times appears in Mark. The
Wow.
word immediately. It's a lot. So Mark is a gospel that moves quickly from one thing to the next. So Mark was likely the oldest or the first gospel to be written down. This is the prevailing theories anyway about which gospel was oldest. It's the shortest gospel. It is the one that has extra endings. There's the traditional shorter ending and the longer ending that appears in some Bibles. The oldest and likely the most original ending is, I think it's 16:8, where the gospel ends and they fled in terror. Speaking of the women who had been at the tomb, they were instructed to go back and tell the disciples, and they fled in terror and told no one, which is an ending that maybe some later Christian editors or translators thought that's a terrible ending. And then they wrote things that sounded better. And so the endings that are called the shorter and longer endings are probably not written by the original author of Mark. And no nativity story that Sharon mentioned. It just starts right in on John the Baptist. So there's no stories before Jesus as an adult. We mentioned how many times the word immediately appears. all of the action in this story really focuses around Galilee. Jesus is not depicted going further out really than the regions of Galilee as he is in some of the other gospels. And Mark is the one that has the messianic secret. That is often Mark is told, or not Mark, Jesus says, don't tell anyone what has happened here, which is pretty unique to Mark. So I talked about this every week, I think, just looking at how the different gospels were composed. And for those who were not here for the introduction to this, maybe you haven't heard it, the theory is that Mark's gospel was written first, that Matthew and Luke both had a copy of Mark's gospel when they composed their gospels, plus another source of material that's represented by Q here, which means source, or stands for source in German, Quell. And no one has ever found a copy of that, but they just surmise that there was another source that had mostly stories of, or sayings of Jesus, or sermons of Jesus. And then both Matthew and Luke also include stories or material that's unique to them and don't appear anywhere else. So this is known as the two-source theory, figuring that Mark and Q were the two sources, sometimes also called the four-source theory. It's the same theory, but the four sources means that Mark and Luke, or Matthew and Luke rather, had, other sources for each of their unique materials. So that's what that's about. So I was thinking a little bit about how this class has gone and kind of what I've focused on. And for people who are really looking to delve into Bible study and want to know what the stories are in the Bible, that's not what this class has been focused on. And so what I want to send out to people are links to a couple of videos that kind of are a little bit more like that from the Bible Project. So if that's really what you're looking for. But we talked a little bit last week about the difference between biblical studies and Bible study, or biblical scholarship and Bible study. And Bible study is for Christians who want to study the Bible and use the Bible's words to try to figure out what God has to say about our faith today. And biblical studies is the kind of scholarship that someone who doesn't have to be a Christian might pursue, looking at the Bible texts and trying to learn things from it and about it. So, and we've talked a little bit about this in previous classes, how they approach this in lots of different ways. It might be they're comparing one Bible story to another, which is what I've been doing. They might look at original texts or different copies of the different Gospels and compare them. They might think about how would the author's original community hear this story? How is it speaking to them? They might look at how does a modern person hear this story? If we start talking about slavery, that hits us very different today than it did in Jesus' time. So there's a lot of different ways that scholars approach the text and learn things, which can, I think, impact and support our faith, but they aren't necessarily driven to discern about faith in particular. They're more using the text as historical documents or literature, if that makes some sense. So, so for people who want to focus, and I do focus, I mean, that's what we do in sermons and preaching and Bible study, is we're looking at, what does this story about the wise men tell us about God and our relationship with God and our faith? I mean, that's Bible study. Biblical scholarship is, how is this word used here? Or why does it say King Herod when it's really King whoever? Or, he's not really a king, or whatever. They really are puzzling over these kind of historical critical details. So that just to say a little bit more about the difference for folks that weren't there for that discussion. Any questions or confusion about that? It's okay if you have them.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to say a little bit about, or just show you this. These are a couple of things I found in my Bible, which is the Harper Collins Study Bible. And maybe you have a Bible that has something like this too. This appears in the Bible right before we get to Matthew's Gospel, kind of introduction. And it shows parallel passages in the four Gospels. So, which is somewhat what the other book is that I have too, which actually has the text laid out, and we'll look at that a little bit later too. But the Matthew, Mark, and Luke Gospels, known as the Synoptic Gospels, have a lot more similarities. So that's why they're synoptic. The Gospel of John, it's not that nothing is the same as in the other Gospels, but there's not as many parallels between John's Gospel and the other Gospels. So it kind of stands alone, and it's thought of as the latest Gospel, or the third Gospel to be written. So just to show you these, I just picked 2 pages out of here just to demonstrate a little bit. So this doesn't necessarily show how Matthew and Luke have a lot in common, because we didn't get to those sections so much yet in these charts, but you can see how, I think, a little bit, how Matthew and Luke have things that are not in Mark. I guess I'm trying to show how scholars might have concluded that Matthew came first, and then, or excuse me, Mark came first, and then Matthew and Luke used Mark, or had a copy of Mark when they composed their Gospels. I mean, another theory is that Matthew and Luke wrote theirs first, and Mark wrote later and kind of distilled them and got rid of all of the extra stuff and tried to make it a really quick moving, story, which is another theory some scholars have, but it's not the widely accepted theory. So any questions or comments about this? We'll come back to it. Does anyone else's Bible have something like that in it? Do you have a study Bible with a parallel passages, or another book? Maybe it'll make a little more sense if you find that and run across it now. So we're going to turn to Matthew. Matthew is represented in icons mostly by an angel with wings. And so if you ever see like 4 statues that are representing the 4 Gospels, or 4 pictures, side by side, Matthew will be an angel with wings. And that likely comes from the beginning of Matthew's Gospel. It's not that they think Matthew, the author of Matthew, was an angel, but that so much of Matthew's Gospel has angel messenger in it, especially at the beginning. Not as much as Luke's, but there is an angel that appears to Joseph at the beginning. So Matthew preserves about 90% of Mark. So if Matthew had a copy of Mark, as they suppose, he used a lot of it. But sometimes he edits or changes what he finds in Mark. He doesn't just like lift Mark and drop it into a different story, or a story that he's written separately. So sometimes the material is organized a little bit differently. So like, for instance, in Mark's Gospel, where Mark starts talking about where Jesus is talking about some parables of the kingdom, Matthew reorganizes it and put it with other parables of the kingdom. So he just kind of shifts it over to a place in his story where it fits more with other material. And sometimes he abbreviates unnecessary details. So we surmise that Matthew had an agenda or a goal or a purpose for how he was going to put this material together. And sometimes if it didn't suit his purpose, he just leaves it out. So I'll show you an example of that next, but I'm going to keep going. So Matthew sometimes uses more polished Greek. So if you're comparing side by side Matthew's gospel and Luke's or Mark's gospel, there are times when Mark or Luke, too many of these. It's like my kids. I mix up their names all the time. Sometimes Matthew will fix the like idiomatic expressions or like a colloquialism or like an expression that Mark uses that's not very sophisticated or fancy or skillful. So he might make it a little bit more polished or sophisticated. In a couple of places, he fixes some inaccuracies. Mark has described a particular king using one word, and Matthew will fix it to be more accurate and use the correct word for that leader. Sometimes Matthew has changed material a little bit to relate more to Matthew's audience. So we think that Mark was writing his gospel, that Mark was probably a Gentile Christian, so was not a Jew. Matthew probably was a Jew. And we're just, we don't have a biography of the authors, but just surmising from the way they wrote, we think that Matthew was probably Jewish himself, writing for a community that at least was familiar with Jewish ways and Jewish practices. So sometimes he will add a detail to what Mark has written that will communicate that he recognizes that they know more about Jewish customs maybe than Mark's audience did. Sometimes, in a couple places, he changes how a character is portrayed, or characters. So, for instance, in Mark's gospel, the disciples have no faith, and they kind of get worse as the gospel goes on. They just are more clueless almost by the end of the gospel, so that finally they, the women run away in terror because they have not figured things out. Well, in Matthew's gospel, there are times when instead of saying, "Oh, why do you have no faith?" he says, "Oh, you of little faith." He gives them a little bit of credit, like they have a little bit of faith. So he slightly shapes that. All right. So this is a piece from the book that I showed you last week, where I can show it both in Greek and in English side by side. As I'm looking at my book, there's two, each page, one side is the same thing in Greek as it is in English. So this is kind of similar to what I showed earlier with a chart that showed parallel passages, but this is what this whole book is like. And it's showing how line by line you can compare similar stories. And it's really interesting. If you're trying to just like read the story of the gospel and know about Jesus, it's not a very good book to find because it's really broken up and scholarshipy like this. But if you are interested in comparing side by side, this is really interesting. So if you look at this story, I just picked this one out. So the middle passage is how Mark is written. The left side is how Matthew tells this same story. And the right side is how Luke tells the same story. And you can see that compared to Mark, Matthew leaves out some important details, or details that the theory is Matthew didn't think it was that important to name all these details. Matthew is being a little bit more brief about things. So the first verse is almost identical. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, which is almost word for word the first line as Matthew. So the chances of that happening without one of them having a copy of the other are like 0, right? So this is the theory that one of them had a copy of the other, and probably Mark was the copy that Matthew had. And when he had come out of the boat, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. That sounds a little weird in English. I think that is a more direct translation from the Greek. So if you were comparing the Greek side to the English side, you could be able to see exactly how that fleshes out. But in Matthew's gospel, it says 2 demoniacs met him coming out of the tombs. And then this part gets really abbreviated. So fierce that no one could pass that way. All right, I'm going to look up Matthew 8:28 so that I can compare what it is in the English directly. Matthew 8:28 says, or Matthew, beginning. When he came to the other side, to the country of the what is that word? Gadarenes, 2 demoniacs coming out of the tombs met him. They were so fierce that no one could pass that way. That's pretty similar to what's here. And behold, they cried out, "What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now, in my Bible, it says, suddenly they shouted, "What have you to do with us, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" That's very close. So if I can, sorry. I have to move things around on my screen so I can see. And I can't see the bottom. If you could see the bottom, in the Mark's gospel, it says, and Jesus asked him, that is the demon spirit, "What is your name?" Matthew doesn't include that. And Matthew often, compared to Mark, leaves out any suggestions that Jesus doesn't know everything. So here Jesus says, "What is your name?" Well, Matthew thinks Jesus would not have asked that because Jesus would have known what his name was. So Matthew omits that. Matthew's version compared to Mark also omits some references to Jesus being kind of having human emotions. So, and I'll find an example of that if we have time and share that. But basically, Matthew is portraying Jesus in a more elevated, holy way and a less human way. So the fancy word for that for theologians is his Christology. He has a higher Christology because the way he shows Christ is more elevated versus Mark, who has a low Christology. So Mark portrays Jesus as a more human being. Is that interesting?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Mhm.
So besides Mark, Matthew also used Q, which are things like the Sermon on the Mount, which we started talking about on Sunday, and Pastor Sheila preached on it. I think it starts in Matthew 5. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain and he sat down. His disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." So that's called the Sermon on the Mount. It does not appear in Mark's gospel at all. and it's pretty long. It goes on from chapter 5 through chapter 7, and it's all things that Jesus said, or teachings. Like, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So that's all part of the Sermon on the Mount, which, because it's also in Luke in a very similar way, we think came from a separate source, which we call Q, because we don't know what it was and we've never found it. So we just call it Q.
Mhm.
So there's quite a lot of that material in Luke, or in Matthew. It's in Luke too, but. All right, so what is unique about Matthew, besides what I just described and how it came to be? And, it's got Mark and Q and extra. So it begins with Jesus' genealogy. So if you have your Bible with you, if you don't, it's okay. But if you looked at Matthew 1, it begins an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then it goes into Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. And it goes on and on and on until we get to Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So that's a genealogy, just like a family tree. It's unique that Matthew begins with this genealogy, but it fits with Matthew's kind of orientation, which is to demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah and fits into the whole Old Testament story of Israel's redemption. So Jesus is part of Jewish history, is kind of what Matthew is trying to describe. And so by laying out this genealogy and saying, here he is, here's how he fits, that's really emphasizing this. That's his first thing, compared to Mark, who starts with John the Baptist. And then in verse 17, it says, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. So 14, this is another kind of thing that's unique to Matthew. Oops, that's not it, but is that Matthew does a lot of groupings, and it seems very intentional about numbers. So the fact that there's 14 here and 14 here and 14 here is significant. Why is it significant? Has something to do with how, 14 is a holy number, and it's holy to Jews because of the number of syllables in Hebrew in the word David, is my understanding. And the number 7 is really significant because it's kind of the number of completeness or holiness, like the 7 days of creation. So 14 is related to 7, and I'm not really into numerology, but for traditions and people who are into that, that's so set. It's very intentional that there's 14. We're going to look later at Luke's genealogy, because Luke has a genealogy too, and it's different from Matthew's. Some of it's the same, some of it's different, but Matthew's is unique because it's from Abraham to Jesus, and it's in groups of 14. And Matthew has a birth story, and I've preached on this a lot, so you've probably heard me say about how this is a different birth story than Luke's gospel. So Matthew's birth story has the story basically from Joseph's viewpoint. The angel appears to Joseph and tells him, don't be afraid to marry Mary. And so they get married, and then the wise men start looking for this new king, following the star, and they encounter Herod. all of that's unique to Matthew. You don't find that story in any other book of the Bible. And that starts in also verse 1 or chapter 1 and going into chapter 2. So when we kind of tell the nativity stories that the kids do, and or when the nativity play, and we have the shepherds and then they leave and then the wise men come, we're putting together two entirely different birth stories from two different gospels. Does that shock and awe anybody? Or is that just
No.
old news? Okay.
No,
Okay.
I'm wondering if Matthew focused on Jesus because his audience was those, was the educated Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, focuses on Joseph, it's the patriarchal thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're exactly right. Yeah, the focus on Mary would not be impactful to a Jewish person or Jewish, first century Jewish person. It was more about the father. It was important. All right, this is also unique. You'll notice that whenever Matthew talks about the kingdom of God, which is how I think of it, he always says the kingdom of heaven. And that started this last Sunday in the reading about the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I don't know if it started with that. I didn't look to see if it came up earlier then, but I know it was there this last Sunday. So, and the reason for this, we surmise, is that Matthew's audience being Jewish or having a heavy Jewish influence, some of them would not appreciate using the word, the name of God so casually. So instead of saying God, they say heaven, the kingdom of heaven. So in some Jewish communities, like, you don't step on a piece of pottery on the ground because it might say the word of God. The word God might be etched into the piece of pottery, the shard. So you're careful about where you step, because that would be insulting to God's name to step on a piece of pottery with God's name on it. So the name of God is very revered. So they use this kingdom of heaven instead of kingdom of God. So if you ever see a Bible or a quote from the Bible that says kingdom of heaven instead of kingdom of God, you can be pretty certain it comes from Matthew's gospel compared to the others. I already mentioned the disciples are slow but not failures in Matthew's gospel. So no faith is changed to little faith. And it's kind of organized in patterns. So the numbers thing with the 14 generations, that's unique. Like the main sections of Jesus' teaching, there's probably 5 of those sections. And scholars surmise that connects to the 5 books of the Torah. So there's 5 sections of Jesus' teaching. Jesus is like Moses because Jesus is part of the long line of prophets for Judah and Israel. So there's 5 sections, like 5 books of the Torah. Something more unique to Matthew compared to Mark is that Peter shows up a lot more and kind of is like a lead spokesperson and has more featured scenes, I guess you could say, where Peter is important. Like Peter walking on water or trying to walk on water, that only appears in Matthew. That's the only place you'll find that story. There's a strong Jewish orientation in some passages where they're really paying a lot of attention. The author's really paying a lot of attention to showing how, like, the disciples and Jesus are being good Jews or are part of the Jewish community. And then in other places, it's strongly anti-Jewish or anti-Jewish leader. So it's been from Matthew's gospel that people who want to blame Jews for the death of Jesus, they've quoted Matthew's gospel because of the passages. There are a couple passages that really sound like it's their fault that Jesus died, even though Jesus was Jewish. So they figure that the reason for that is that when Matthew was writing, there must have been some tension between the Jewish Christians, the Jesus following Jews, and the Jewish authorities. And that's reflected in this gospel.
Mhm.
And you also see in this gospel a lot of focus on worship, like the wise men come and they pay homage, they worship the baby. They there's just a lot of places, Jesus is going to worship in the synagogue. And then there's a lot of critique of worldly power also that shows up in this. So those are some things unique about Matthew. And I'm going to end with this. What we figure scholar-wise about who wrote the Matthew's gospel, when, and for whom. So some early traditions have tried to make the case that Matthew was written by the disciple named Matthew, who is also called Levi in some other gospels. The tax collector, Matthew the tax collector, one of the disciples, but it never says that in the gospel itself. It's not like, and Jesus called Matthew the tax collector. That was me. There's nothing like that in this gospel. So most scholars don't really think that is likely, that the author was one of the disciples, the original disciples, that they probably wrote at the end of the lifespan of those disciples. So it's not unlikely. They think that the gospel reflects the concerns of really second generation Christians, likely written after most of those original disciples had died. So most scholars date this gospel between 80 and 90 CE or AD. CE stands for Common Era. And it means AD if that's what you grew up with. If you remember, the Mark gospel, they thought is dated between 60 and 70, most likely, when it was written. So there's probably a good 10 years between them. We think that he was likely a Jewish author, maybe someone who reads Hebrew because of how he uses Hebrew in the way he writes. Possibly a converted rabbi, a rabbi who became a follower of Jesus. And there's a lot of concern in the gospel to show that the scriptures are interpreted correctly. And there's a lot of places in Matthew's gospel where the writer will say, as it says in the scriptures, and then he'll quote, and he's quoting the Old Testament, parts of the Old Testament. And that's to show the connection with Jewish history. And they suppose it was written for, they try to decide, like, okay, where was the author writing? Who were they writing to, or who was it for? And they think it was probably written for a more prosperous urban community compared to Matthew or to Mark, who was probably more of a rural Galilean community, and a community that included both Gentiles and Jews as part of the community. It's not written only for Jewish readers, because it's also really clear that in this gospel that Jesus also came for the Gentiles in the way that it's written. And why was it written? I mean, they kind of suspect that maybe the author didn't think that Mark's gospel was enough. I mean, if the author of Matthew had a copy of Mark, why would he write his own? Why didn't he just share Q and Mark and say, here you go, this is it? So probably he didn't think that Mark's theology was complete enough. It didn't show enough connection with Jewish history. And so that's why Matthew decided to write this gospel and put all this together. Does that make any sense?
Mhm.
All right. That is Matthew for today. What questions or thoughts do you have as we get ready to close?
How long does it say how long it took them to write the gospel?
It doesn't say. Yeah, we don't really have any way of knowing that, but it was a
Yeah.
significant undertaking
Yeah.
to put it together. Yeah.
Hmm.
Any other thoughts or questions? Is this kind of what you were thinking this was going to be, or what you would be
Yeah.
looking for? Okay.
I think it's very informative.
Mhm.
It's interesting.
Well, I will send you all and the other folks that have been with us some links to a couple other videos about the
Yes.
Gospels. If you want to do more
Did
study
you
on your
send
own.
some out last week? Because I don't think I got any.
I did not. I'm going to do that today, though. I'll
Okay.
send them to everybody.
Yeah.
So everybody will
Okay,
have the
good.
same
Yep.
things. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for coming today. It's good to see
Thank
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.